And let's introduce our speakers now. We are very lucky today to have with us Professor Ernesto Macaro, Emeritus Professor of Applied Linguistics at the University of Oxford, Professor Heath Rose, Professor of Applied Linguistics at the University of Oxford, and Mark Searle, Honorary Norham Fellow of the University of Oxford. So I'm going to pass on to my colleague, Samantha, who's going to introduce the session for today.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who's joined us from all over the world, whatever time zone you're in. And particularly thank you to those from the United Kingdom, as it's a bank holiday today, and you could be off enjoying the sunshine that we've got at the moment. So delighted to be here to moderate today's session. We've got Professor Ernesto Macaro and Mark Searle, who will be talking about mainly their recent book, Navigating English Medium Instruction, a student handbook, very much needed in the literature. So I'll start off with Ernesto, just to declare any interests. Ernesto was my PhD supervisor, and so I'm slightly biased towards the quality of his work, but he really has done research across various topics throughout his career: second language learning strategies, code switching, and recently focusing on English medium instruction, and was the director and founder of the Center for Research of English medium instruction in Oxford. And still very active, although emeritus professor, so we're really grateful for him continually publishing his ideas and also sharing with us today. Mark Searle, Honorary Norham Fellow, Department of Education, co-author of this amazing handbook on student English medium instruction and how we can support student learning. He's also served as a senior consultant trainer for the British Council, and has also delivered EMI training programs, so bringing that great experience to today's session. And then Professor Heath Rose, who's obviously a leading figure in applied linguistics, also Vice Principal of Lincoln College at Oxford, and his research focuses on global Englishes. EMI has done some on learning strategies as well, and teaching English as an international language, so really focusing on moving away from native speakerism. And Heath was also based in Japan for a while, Ireland, was a language teacher all over the world, and really has published numerous books and brings great expertise today to our discussion. So yeah, great. I'll stop talking now, so hand over to the speakers. So yeah, over to you, Ernesto and Mark, and thank you all so much for being here. Much appreciated.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, thank you very much for the invitation to talk about this. And I'm going to, do I need to share, or are we already on there? Okay. Okay. So the title I've given to my section of the talk, they are supposed to be interlinked, the three talks, is language learning strategies, theorizing their application to medium instruction contexts. And that's what I'm trying to particularly do here, is to sort of say, okay, well, there's this whole background of language learning strategies. How do we now apply them to EMI? So let's do that. But we'll start with the definition I've been using. It does need quite a lot of unpacking, absolutely, and it can be challenged, but it's the use of the English language to teach academic subjects other than English itself, and that's quite important, in countries or jurisdictions in which the majority of the population's first language is not English. So the bit that says the use of the English language, as Mustafa Akinsyoglu has pointed out, it does not mean sole use, it can mean partial use, but the important thing is there is some substantial use of the English language to teach academic subjects and not English. I'll come back to that in a little while as well. So that's the definition I've been using. I think it's reasonably well accepted. Let's just start with a few perceptions of EMI from students around the world, and back in 2006, Erin Linda was saying that students asked and answered fewer questions when they were involved in learning through an EMI process, and reported being less able to follow the lecture and take notes at the same time. These kind of challenges coming up all the time. In Turkey, students expressed that comprehension of the content, specifically the terminology, was a big challenge. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done on what they mean by the terminology. I think that expresses well the overall consensus about the problem they have with terminology. In Turkey again, most students turn to translation as a tool for both understanding the subject matter and learning new vocabulary. And clearly, of course, you can't separate the two things, because the subject matter is learnt through learning new vocabulary. In Oman, students faced a range of challenges and difficulties, and numerous coping strategies were utilized to complete their engineering studies. Coping strategies, an interesting phrase that sometimes it's used in a slightly pejorative way, or to sort of say, oh, I'm just about coping with this. And then finally, I just wanted to put one from Johnson and Piccioli in Italy. By focusing on factors that influence lecture comprehension, the authors maintain we can develop more effective pedagogical strategies and training programs for both EMI lecturers and, very importantly, for the purposes of this webinar, and students. Yes, so it's about pedagogical and training programs for lecturers and students. Okay, so I've always, I thought quite a bit about who is responsible for getting EMI right, for success in EMI. And obviously the obvious answer is everybody is, the EMI teacher is responsible. They've got to, do a good job of delivering their particular discipline through the medium of English. Is it the EAP, ESP support teacher, or teachers, or group of teachers who are in the institution and are there to ensure that the right amount of support is given and the right quality of support is given to EMI students, particularly, I think, to undergraduates, perhaps in their first year. And coming to that, if we look on the right-hand side there, the EFL teacher, some people, a few people I think have mentioned this in the past, but it seems to me we need to also look at that as EMI increases in higher education. Then is there a responsibility of the EFL teacher prior to transition in ensuring that some thought is given to the type of academic language that is needed in order to do well on an EMI program? And then finally, of course, it's the student teacher, and that's the one really that we are focusing on. The student or the learner, the one that we are focusing on today, who, it's his or her responsibility as well, very much so. And that's all part of the whole notion of taking responsibility for one's learning. So if we then go back to the origins of language learning strategies, we have to go right back to the 1970s and the notion of the good language learner, and also to the notion of communicative competence. In other words, Curle and Swain will say, well, okay, in order to communicate well, you not only need language, but you need tricks, you need strategies, you need, ways, methods of communicating in order to overcome your difficulties. So, so trying to bring that notion of language learning strategy into the EMI context, we have to think about the good language learner and the notion of communicative competence. Just coming back to my just going to a definition of strategies now. It's quite a long one, I'm afraid, but I will just read it through. Strategies are the conscious, goal-oriented, that's really important, mental actions that learners deploy, often in clusters, i.e., in order to have them interrelated, in relation to a language use or a language learning task. These clusters of mental actions may need to be adapted as and when different task types are encountered by the student. The strategic behavior that the student adopts will have varying degrees of intensity according to the difficulty of the task and relative to a learner's linguistic knowledge. Contributing to the level of difficulty of the task is the learner's prior knowledge of the topic. So obviously the ones I've put in color, I'm going to try and deal with briefly in this short session. Just to remind ourselves about what strategies, how strategies are divided up into categories. Chameau back in O'Malley and Chameau back in 1990, we're talking about cognitive strategies. That's the visualizing a word I hear, for example. You have to interface with the language, what's going on in your head. The metacognitive ones are things like planning, monitoring, evaluating what's going on in the learning, and evaluating your use of strategies in relation to the learning. Affective strategies is getting into the right frame of mind, not being phased, and so on. And then social strategies are things like trying to talk to native speakers. And you can already begin to see when you're trying to apply that kind of idea, or all those four, but particularly the last one, to the EMI context, trying to talk to native speakers, what does that actually mean, trying to adapt the theory of strategies to EMI, it needs some work and some thinking. Just briefly, the claims made in language learning strategy research, quantity and range of strategy use correlates well with learner proficiency and attainment. In other words, the more and the range that you use, you tend to do better. There are individual differences and group differences in language learner strategy use. One individual group difference particularly has been in the past that females use more strategies and more effectively than males. And then strategy-based instruction, i.e. copying what we might call the good language learner, is effective in promoting learner proficiency. Okay, back to my definition of strategies. I would argue you can be struggling to get a more language use situation than an EMI classroom or lecture theatre. But let's also think about how that might pan out across disciplines. I've tended to use this distinction between policy-led EMI and language-led EMI, where the policy-led one is there is a policy decision to teach those subjects through the medium of English, although they could perfectly well or reasonably well be taught through the medium of the first language. So in Italy, for example, it's perfectly possible to teach physics through the medium of Italian, even though obviously there's more published through the medium of English, but it is possible to do it. It is possible to do it. There are, on the other hand, language-led subjects such as internet studies, journalism, applied linguistics. As you go down the list, it gets even more pronounced that it's very difficult to get away from the English language, and when you get to TESOL, it becomes impossible. So, in a sense, the strategic behaviour has to adapt itself to the particular discipline that the student is in. So it's got language implication and strategy use implications. I also maintain that strategies are conscious, goal-oriented. In other words, you need to have some clear goal in mind, but it's actually difficult sometimes to know why students opt for EMI programs rather than non-EMI programs. And I think one could begin by, if doing a piece of research, you could begin by asking about goal orientation and in a kind of hierarchical approach to it. So general question would be, when you are listening to your teacher in your biology lesson, do you spend more time thinking about biology or about the English language, just to get a feel for whether they are in there more about the language, or more worried about the language, or more worried about the content. Of course, you can't separate the two, but it's worth asking that kind of question. And then how do you overcome anxiety? And that anxiety can be before, during, or after the lecture or the lesson. Moving down, what are the listening strategies that you adopt or use in your biology lesson? And so you're sort of bringing it down. Do you listen out for your teacher's discourse markers? You know, things like, and now we're going to do this. Having done this, we now need to look at this. And finally, how do you deal with teacher intelligibility issues? You can't work out what the teacher is saying. And so, you know, I think that goal orientation has to be, you know, I would suggest has to have some kind of hierarchical approach, which narrows down to very fine issues, questions. So we did a study with Heath Rose was on in the group of learners in Italy on EMI programs, and we asked that kind of question. You know, do you think more about the English language as when you're more concerned about language, or are you more concerned about content? I don't know if you can see the top there. So if I take that off. That's better. So when you enter an EMI classroom, do you focus more on the subject or more on improving your English? And you can see that very much, you know, they were oriented to thinking about their subject. The aim, the objective is about really the content. They're not necessarily thinking about improving their language. And then we asked a number of questions, and these were things that students said they did a lot. They scored high. They say this is true or very true of me. So they make notes of key words. Now that's an interesting question. What's a key word? But nevertheless they said that. They made notes of explanations given by the teacher. They were aware of the differences in the types of vocabulary, academic vocabulary, general academic, specific vocabulary to the discipline, and so on. They, during the lesson, tried to guess the meaning of an English word from the context, because that's very much a strategy in language learning. After the lesson, they reviewed materials, and after the lesson, they reviewed notes they'd made. So those are the things that they did do in response to our questionnaire. These are the things they didn't do, however. They didn't do much prep before the lesson, which I think increasingly we begin to think is important in EMI. Didn't preview notes or preview topics or preview any vocabulary that was likely to come up, or listen to lectures on the internet or MOOCs that they'd been given. So there wasn't any preparation. There was an expectation that the knowledge and understanding would come during the lecture. And they also didn't do much of this. Didn't ask the teacher to explain, didn't ask the teacher for an explanation of these technical words, which they are constantly telling us are the problem, nor did they ask for explanation of more general academic words or even everyday words. Now, that may be that in lectures, particularly in the Italian context, teachers don't want students to ask questions, but nevertheless, that's what they said. Again, things they didn't do. They didn't ask for an Italian an L1 equivalent. Didn't ask the teacher to repeat. Didn't ask for clarification, whether it was in English or in Italian. So there's not a lot of what we found with basic is not a lot of engagement with the situation, and they didn't do a lot after the lecture either. Just want to briefly talk about the question of when we're thinking about strategies and about knowledge of the topic. Now, prior knowledge of the topic in language learning is a key strategy. Or it's a source for using strategies. If you know the topic that the text is about, you can say, oh, you know, I know about this, and therefore I think that this phrase must mean this. Now, how does that work out in an EMI classroom? Well, let's think about that. Prior knowledge of the topic is likely to be more important in EFL or EMI. Well, how can we judge that? Because we don't know what the level of prior knowledge a student will have of a particular area that they're learning. but also EFL texts. You know, the EFL teacher will select a text according to the level of the student, or they were not going to choose an outlandish text just in order to put the student into a very difficult position of actually having to understand the language only through the language without some prior knowledge of the topic. So they kind of graded EFL texts, whereas EMI texts are not graded, particularly teacher talk texts. They're not graded by the teacher for the topic. They have to follow a topic curriculum. So when we're talking about trying to apply strategies, the prior knowledge strategy to EMI, we have to realize that this is different from a language learning classroom. And then there's the question about the different subjects. So, for example, in politics, students, if they're studying politics, they will have some world knowledge already, even before they've gone into the classroom. They'll have some specific event knowledge. The election of a new president of the United States. They will have personal knowledge. Maybe they will have had somebody in the family who's taken part in politics. And then they will have some academic learned knowledge of politics. Now, if you look at particle physics, on the other hand, that's some world knowledge. There might be some world knowledge, but that's going to be fairly limited. And it's going to be mostly academic learned knowledge. Yeah. So again, when we're asking about prior knowledge and the prior knowledge strategy, it depends on the discipline, I think, that we're looking at. At least we should go into any research that we do, thinking about the disciplines are different. Coming back to that definition of strategies, then the difficulty of the task. Okay, the strategic behavior, I'm arguing, will have varying degrees of intensity according to the difficulty of the task and the linguistic knowledge that the student have. So, in any EMI listening task, i.e. listening to a lecture, the student will have some linguistic knowledge. They'll have vocabulary, grammar, discourse, pragmatic and sociocultural knowledge, okay? That's what they walk into the classroom with. That will vary by individual, but nevertheless, that's a fairly constant at that moment in time. And then the strategic behavior will be what the learners do with the linguistic knowledge and the content knowledge, plus new information that they have. So, if the task is reasonably well balanced, then the linguistic knowledge will work fairly well with the strategic behavior, and the task will be achieved. I.e., they will understand what the teacher is saying, and they'll keep that information in their heads. However, if the task becomes very difficult, the teacher speaks too quickly, uses too many new words, doesn't have a kind of pedagogical approach which is suitable, in my view, suitable to students whose language is not English, then clearly the strategic behavior has to increase. They have to work much, much harder in order to understand that linguistic knowledge stays the same. They can't change that overnight, but the strategic behavior will have to increase. If it's a very easy task and the teacher does it very slowly and prepare, and then the linguistic knowledge again stays the same, but the strategic behavior becomes less. So that's as far as I'm going to go for now, because I was only allocated half an hour, quite rightly, and Mark and Heath are going to follow. But here are some strategy research papers which you may like to follow up. But just to sum up, what I've been trying to do is to say, okay, we've got this background in language learning, which is about what the student does to help herself or himself in a learning situation. Is there anything we can take from that that makes sense, that can be useful, and that we can think about how that needs to be adapted in an EMI context? So that's it. Thank you for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ernesto. Very engaging and super insightful there.